Now I gotta warn ya, striving for realistic, impactful, and well-paced character development is a little bit like striving for the Holy Grail. We tend to see people, and by extension characters, as being in one place in time, and recognizing that they haven't always been like that, and won't always either, is really hard to remember and be actively cognizant of. A year ago, you might not have been doing what you're doing right now. Your life situation may have been completely different, and maybe you've gotten better at some things since then. Without regularly checking up on yourself, though, it's hard to appreciate that, or recognize it's even happening. In media, especially that which takes place over decades like Star Wars, it's very easy to get caught up in the moment of what you're seeing. You're seeing but one brief period of a person's life, and it's easy to compartmentalize them as just that, but they may change into a very different person as they grow older. Vader is actually a perfect example. You will see people argue back and forth on whether or not he's still Anakin or not underneath the mask. The real answer is pretty obviously no, because any 60-year-old man is going to barely resemble his 20-year-old self, and that's true whether or not they decide to become Space Hitler for their midlife crisis. Most media does not span decades, however. You tend to see characters go through radical development over the span of a few months, weeks, or, God forbid, days. This is not necessarily unrealistic, especially for a young person, but it can come off incredibly fake if not done without proper care or setup. It also tends to get exponentially worse the smaller the time frame. I'll just get the really easy example out of the way quick. Every Star Wars story ever told is about some Imperial realizing the Empire is bad and rebelling. To give Battlefront 2 as an example, because it is the most egregious one, the time frame given there for its protagonist to become disloyal to the Empire and rebel is not a gradual disillusion over years, it is one event. They are wholly, entirely loyal enough to have a personal meeting with the Emperor, and after one war crime, instant defection. This should be their first step on the road to defection, the first horror they've witnessed to be repressed and shoved under their bed, to be denied and ignored, and in their eyes, for the greater good. They should see multiple crimes committed by the Empire over a long period of service, and then see those effects firsthand for it to not come off as completely ridiculous. You do not completely abandon everything you've believed for your entire life after you see one thing that contradicts it. You ignore it, you deny it, you make up an excuse for why it's okay, actually, even if it's a horrible excuse for a horrible thing. It takes many moons for that doubt and realization to foster, because you don't want to believe that what you learned growing up was wrong, and in the context of Star Wars, that the government that has been around you all your life is evil. Writing this is really hard, and that's partially because while everyone goes through personal growth to become better as they get older, not a lot of people have experience with the truly intensive stuff they depict their characters going through, like coming to terms with killing an entire pantheon, yourself, and the world. Or, in his son's case, being a god of a possibly dead race with unreasonably high expectations to end the world. I want to talk about God of War for the rest of this because it shows great examples of how to and how not to do character development, which can be super valuable to learn from. On the good side is its dialogue writing. It might be the best I've ever seen in a AAA game.
If you never asked Mom about what she used to do, what did you talk about when you met? Like, did you just say, "Woman, guard the house. I will go to catch fish in the river," and then leave for 5 days?
Characters talk like actual people and have convincing conversations back and forth, and every conversation isn't just an excuse to spew exposition. They're used as moments to reflect on information that's already been given and ponder on the best choice to make, and while ultimately what they settle on is pretty unsatisfying, it's good that they show the characters clearly thinking about their actions. Especially when the story you want to tell, as God of War's is riddled with shame, trauma, and guilt, it can be all too easy to address and fix those things way too quickly and with not enough care. Speaking from experience, trauma is not something you can talk away with a single 5-minute conversation. It lingers and affects you in ways you can't even realize because it is so innate and personal. It's taken Kratos a huge time skip and 2 fully padded out as hell games and a DLC to even begin to get over his trauma and guilt, and honestly that's a pretty realistic time frame.
Well, that's Pitbull winner for you.
Character development is spurred by one of 2 things, time and trauma. Unfortunately, writers don't often have the luxury of time. Media is often depicting events that are extremely time-sensitive, like the literal end of the world, and don't have an opportunity for a quick character growth diversion. Trauma, as in extremely impactful events usually involving significant personal loss, are the other main source of character development. Luke finding his dead parents, Sindri witnessing Brock's death, Kratos doing this, and Anakin disarming Windu are all great examples of this. Well, in truth, Anakin doing this and becoming Vader is more like the culmination of Palpatine's grooming, but it still counts. Maybe hearing the news of Padme's death and delivering the worst no in cinema history might be a better example. Whatever. Ideally, you'd want to include both time and trauma, which brings up something really, really important. For a development to not feel contrived, your explanation should also have an explanation. Giving 2 or more reasons for something to happen will make it feel a lot more natural. For an example, Ragnarok's Valhalla DLC is about Kratos coming to terms with the horrors he committed in the original trilogy, and accepting that those actions do not determine who he is today. This little side story is a great example of utilizing both trauma and time to further development of a character, because without one or the other, the whole premise would fall apart. Because this is happening decades after those events, his newfound acceptance of himself comes off as pretty genuine because of the huge time gap. He has had plenty of time, far too much time, to ponder and think about these things both on and off screen. If this took place, like, a year after the original trilogy of games, it'd seem completely ridiculous. And of course, without the original trauma, there would be nothing for him to come to terms with. Having an explanation for your explanation is a really good rule to live by in general, even unrelated to character development. Something happening by coincidence is not going to be satisfying, nor is a character acting like an idiot just because they're dumb. That brings me to what God of War does poorly, because a lot of the story is pushed on Atreus being an idiot, which is itself excused exclusively by him being a teenager. Atreus decides of his— yeah, I know it's Atreus. Atreus decides of his own volition to go to Asgard against literally everyone else's wishes. The entire Scooby Gang, including Odin in disguise, tells him it's a bad idea, and he does it anyway.
Great. I guess everybody's against me now.
If he was encouraged by even one person, even the squirrel voiced by ProZD, that would be enough.
You mean nothing to me. Nothing at all. Goodbye. I love you.
Going, he's a teenager, as the entire excuse for him to do something stupid is internally consistent, but deeply unsatisfying and also kind of lazy. The reason Atreus does this is because he was forced to for the format of the story to make sense. He needed to be away from the main cast for long periods of time to let everyone simmer and sizzle and develop in a time that seems plausible. The excuse given just sucks. I would like to emphasize that sticking the landing is pretty important. The journey is more important than the destination really isn't true in my opinion, because if the destination is crap, then the journey becomes pointless in retrospect. Ragnarok sets up quite a bit of interesting development with Thor, but when it's time for the culmination of his story where he stands up with Kratos and his family against his father, he just dies, with no ceremony. The moments where they build up his character are still entertaining and well done, but looking back, pointless. I can appreciate how well put together some of these sections are, but when I know that they amount to nothing, it's hard to care, mainly because the scene that we could have gotten would have been so much better. Atreus too managed this about 5 minutes after Thor dies. He's got the magical mask MacGuffin in his hands, which took a few hours of my life to put together, and when it comes time to use it and get some answers, he instead cracks it in half, rendering hours and hours of the story completely pointless. Yes, in theory, this scene is supposed to show Atreus siding with Kratos over Odin, but that was never really in question if you so much as look at the box art. Even without that meta-knowledge, it's still flawed because Kratos is there in the scene at the side and just goes like, "Do whatever, I trust you, boy." Which is in itself, I would argue, wildly out of character and also dumb. Sure, Kratos is learning to trust his son more, but in this scene, Kratos is fighting the guy who tried to groom his kid. You can have the most amazingly written character dialogue of all time and the most gripping character development ever put to paper, but if it's in service of nothing, literally, what is the point? Character development by its nature is like a sister to foreshadowing, and foreshadowing something that never comes to be is not interesting, it's annoying, and it's frustrating. Do not waste people's time by teasing them with a story that is more interesting than the one that you're actually telling. Character development should be in service of something. It's good on its own, but if something happens as a result of it that highlights how far the character has come, that is the holy grail. I do want to give some thanks before I go this time. I got to revisit the hospital again for another kidney stone visit last week, and afterwards one of my viewers told me that they downloaded my videos just to watch and listen to them at work, which was really, really sweet. A very sincere thanks from me for watching my stuff and, for some, finding it valuable enough to support. When YouTube comments are the way that they are, it's hard to remember that sometimes people do actually like my work. Thanks to my patrons, Emmy and Potato especially. Like, comment, subscribe, you know the drill, and have a good night. I get to talk about Helldivers next time.